Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk about the fallacy of false choice, or as they're often called, false dichotomies. I'm going to use the phrase the fallacy of false choice because I think it's more accurate. Usually, when you see this, it is a false dichotomy, but they can possibly be more complicated, although they're usually not. Um, Fallacy of false choice is basically when you set things up or somebody sets things up so that they eliminate legitimate options. They give us a choice between, their preferred option and some other options that are maybe kind of stupid, usually just one option. They show that those are wrong and it's supposed to be a reason to accept their option, right? Um, so we'll talk about what this mistake is, and I think I'll say a little bit about why people often fall for it, right? Because, the logical fallacies that people fall for, and they do fall for this one, there's usually something behind it. There's usually a reason why these look convincing. Okay, so let's say a little bit about, just to give you guys an idea of what this is, let's give a few examples. So here's an example of an argument that commits this fallacy of false choice. This one has a false dichotomy, right? All the ones I'm going to have today have a false dichotomy, just you guys should be aware there are more complicated versions. So, argument goes, we should either do nothing and let the Syrian civil war run its course, or we should send in U.S. troops. Sending in U.S. troops is likely to result in a Vietnam-style quagmire, and it may well spark a war with Russia, so we should not send in U.S. troops. Therefore, we should do nothing and let the war run its course. Now, think about it. What's wrong with this argument, right? What should you find fishy here? Well, you should find the first line fishy, right? We should either do nothing or we should go and send in troops, right? The argument gives us these two extreme options. It argues against one of them and says we ought to choose the other, right? That's not true, right? Or that's way too quick, because we can think of all kind of other options that aren't as extreme as sending in troops, but that do more than just sitting back and doing nothing, right? There's diplomatic pressure, there's aid to Syrian rebels that's not sending our own troops in. There's all kinds of things we could do besides the two options it gives. Now look, I'm not saying we should do any of those things, I'm just saying the argument is too hasty and just ruling out those options. Here's another couple examples from recent politics. Bernie Sanders often gave an argument like this, or some of his followers would, and it would say, well, we must choose between a political revolution and allowing the American economic system to remain as it is. The American economic system as it is now is unfair to many people. Therefore, we cannot allow the system to remain as it is, so we must choose a political revolution. Now, look, you might agree with this argument, you might not, but even if you agree with the current economic system is unfair, it doesn't show that we have to have a whole-scale revolution, right? There are other things we could do besides nothing and completely rethinking the system. Argument has a false choice. One that people would offer against these lines, America faces a choice between Soviet-style communism and liberty. We all know how awful communism was, so we must choose liberty, right? Again, plenty of things between communism and however this person defines liberty, right? Anyway, hopefully this gives you guys an idea of the false dichotomy or the fallacy of false choice. Now, I want you to notice something interesting about these arguments. Think about the form of the arguments I've given you guys. I mean, they're a little more complicated since they give proof for some of their lines, but they all look like this. A or B, not A, therefore B, right? Now think about it. Is this a valid form of argument? A or B, not A, so B. Well, as a matter of fact, it is. This is a valid form of argument. Argument by elimination, right? You've got your two options. You see that one of them's not the case, so you have to go with the other option. Now, y'all might be thinking to yourselves, well, if false dichotomies are valid arguments, how can I say they're a fallacy? How can I even say there's something wrong with them? Obviously, there's something wrong with them, but wait a minute, they're valid, right? Well, remember this, though. Remember, does an argument, if it's valid, does all an argument needs to be is valid to be a good argument? Think back a bit, right? It doesn't, right? An argument needs to be both valid and sound, right? Sound means that an argument is valid and it has true premises. The problem with the false dichotomy isn't, the form of the argument. The problem with the false dichotomy or the false choice is that one of its premises is false, right? The initial disjunction that narrows this down to two options, that is a false premise. In the case of false dichotomies, it is not the fact that A or B, it's actually something more complicated. And for that reason, philosophers will call the fallacy of false choice, along with some other fallacies that we're not really going to cover, they'll call them informal fallacies. And all this means is with a formal fallacy, you can just look at the form of the argument, you can do a truth table or something and see where it goes wrong. With an informal fallacy, it's not at the level of the form it goes wrong, it's just that in putting your premises and even formulating the argument initially, you make a mistake. The mistake occurs here at the level of initially presenting your premises. When you formulate premise one here, or whoever does it, they've already went wrong. Hopefully that's fairly clear to you guys, but let me give you an example to make this clear. We'll take apart one of these fallacy of false choice arguments. This is one your reading mentions. I'm actually going to try to dig this up. I might put it on the course website. It's actually really funny. Years ago, Stephen Colbert, before he became the Late Show host, he had this show where he just basically played an idiot, right? And one of the things with Stephen Colbert playing an idiot was that he just loved bad arguments, right? Colbert was a philosophy major for a bit. He actually changed his major, but he studied a fair amount of philosophy, right? And one of the ways you could see this is he just loved terrible arguments, just took glee in them, right? And so he had this congressman, Barney Frank, on. Barney Frank, very, very liberal, also as politicians of all ideological groups tend to be a bit pompous, right? And so he has Frank on, and of course Barney Frank, being extremely liberal, does not care for George W. Bush, who was the president at the time. And so Colbert says to Barney Frank, George W. Bush, great president or the greatest president? Barney Frank says, well, he's certainly not the greatest president, and he's going to go on kind of a tear. Colbert interrupts him and says, okay, I'm putting you down for great then. I'm leaving some stuff out here. Barney Frank muttered some other stuff, and Colbert's like, it's the lesser of the two options. It's the one you got to go with. Now look, it's not the only option. It's not the one Frank has to go with, right? Whatever you think of George W. Bush, there are options to evaluate him and his presidency besides great president or greatest president, right? Look, Colbert says, I'm not going to give you guys the whole symbolization, but Colbert basically says G or R. Great president or the greatest. Well, the actual choice probably looks something more like this, right? It's probably even more complicated. Greatest president, great president, good president with O, mediocre president with M, B, bad president with B, T, terrible president, or W, worst president ever, right? I think it's safe to say that Barney Frank would have chosen something in these B, T, or W options, right? Now look, here's the thing. Arguments using the false dichotomy and argument by elimination, sometimes that form of argument is a perfectly good argument for establishing legitimate conclusions, positive conclusions, right? You present all the options and then you eliminate all the options except the one you favor. Here's the problem though. In most cases, those arguments are a heck of a lot of work, right? Because in most cases, you don't just have two options. In most cases, you have lots of options, right? And to establish your favored conclusion through elimination, you've got to eliminate all the other options and show that yours is the only one standing. And obviously, if you have, even this is simplified, but if you have, 6, 7, 8 other options, it's going to take a lot of work to refute 7 other options and leave yours as the last one standing. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes if we can't establish our conclusion any other way, that's a perfectly legitimate form of argument. The problem with the false choice is it's lazy. The person saves themselves all the work of having to refute all the other options they need to. All right, so hopefully you guys see what the fallacy of false choice is, right? Colbert's disjunction here, the simple one, is just false because these are not the only options, right? The actual choice, this long string on the disjunction, this one might be true. Colbert's probably not, right? And notice what else he's doing. He's begging the question by just assuming something here his opponent won't accept, right? It's just, as with a lot of fallacious arguments, it's just an elaborate form of question begging. So here's how, just to kind of lay this out, here's how the trick works, right? Here's how people use this fallacy of false choice. What people will usually do is restrict the choice to a really stupid one, right? Really stupid position. And philosophers will often call this, your book calls this a straw man, right? And the thought here is, if you beat up on a straw man or you fight a straw man, I think the thought was, target practice or whatever, the straw man can't fight back, right? It's easy to defeat this. When you have the false choice, you have the straw man, the weak position, and a more sensible one. You refute the stupid position because that's easy, and then you claim to have established the position you favor. So, usually works with this straw man position, right? Think of the ones I had before. Sending in troops or socialism in the sense of Soviet communism. All those are things that we don't want to do. Those are kind of silly positions. Well, easy to knock those down. The person thinks they've established their position. They really haven't, right? To establish their position, they'd need to take on more serious opponents. They save themselves the work of doing that. Okay. So why is the fallacy of false choice so tempting? Your book doesn't say anything about this, but I think with any of these fallacies that people fall for or use as cheap sort of rhetorical tricks, I think it's worth asking ourselves why people fall for them. And for fallacies that people fall for, there's usually something behind them. They look like a valid form of argument, or they look like something that works. So why is the fallacy of false choice so tempting? I think one reason is that it is formally valid, right? Once you allow that initial disjunction that these arguments need, they run, right? The problem is, they're not sound because that initial disjunction is false, but formally, they work. Another reason I think these are tempting is that refutation and argument by elimination are really common and important ways of establishing conclusions. If you ever see proofs in formal logic, if you take logic classes after this, or you ever take high-level math classes, these are used all the time. These are really important. We use these in everyday language, right? In everyday arguments, right? If your wife or husband or friend wants to go to a restaurant and you want to go to a different option, well, what do? You give reasons to reject all the other options besides the place you want to go to, right? This place is too crowded, this place has bad service, this place is too expensive, but this one has okay service and it's not too pricey and I can get that hamburger I want, right? We do that. That's pretty common. One other reason that I think false choice looks convincing is it looks like excluded middle. All right, so what is excluded middle? Excluded middle is just the statement P or not P. And most logicians, I'll talk about this in a second, this is maybe just the slightest bit controversial. I bet you guys never thought, oh, there are controversies in logic. Well, there are. Excluded middle is the slightest bit controversial, but practically all logicians accept this. And excluded middle just says P or not P. And excluded middle is, according to most logicians, true by definition. It's a tautology, right? Just it can't be false, or at least according to most logicians. So P or not P, it's either P or it isn't. Now we haven't talked much about this, in like actual day-to-day logic, arguments that you're going to have with other people. This probably isn't going to figure much. Formal proofs in more advanced logic and formal proofs in mathematics, this actually is pretty important. So P or not P, and excluded middle says you can just kind of help yourself to that, right? And it's useful because, P or not P, then if you can prove not P, you've proved P, right? I'll talk about in a second why this is maybe just the slightest bit controversial, but keep in mind the important things to know are most logicians accept it, and what I'm going to talk about in a minute, this excluded middle, which most logicians will treat as perfectly legitimate, looks like, to some people, false dichotomy or false choice, which is not legitimate. Everybody agrees this is a bad form of argument, right? Okay, so here's some examples of excluded middle and how it differs from the false dichotomy. So excluded middle, all objects are either white or they're not. A more roundabout play on this, well, everything's either black or white, right? Now, what excluded middle is saying is not everything's either black or white. What it's saying is it's either white or it isn't, right? And now I remember when I took logic, there was some guy in class, he was kind of annoying, and he's like, well, what about shades of gray? And of course the logic professor says, well, is gray white? And the student's like, well, no. And he's like, well, it's not white then, right? It's either white or it isn't. Gray isn't white. Not a counterexample. False dichotomy is something different. A false dichotomy says, well, all objects are either black or white, right? That's an example of a false dichotomy. WX or not WX is a completely different thing than WX or BX, right? Most logicians will treat WX or not WX as just true by definition. You do a truth table, this, you guys can waste your time doing this if you want, but if you want to do a truth table, you'll see that this disjunction is always true no matter what your truth of WX is, right? Now, false dichotomy says, well, it's either black or white. If that's what we were saying, then this shades of gray thing would be an objection because there are things between black and white, right? So hopefully you guys can see the difference, right? Excluded middle, well, it's, an example, it's either white or it's not. Things that are blue, gray, green, whatever, that's not an objection because, well, you just say, well, they fall under this not WX, right? False dichotomy would be trying to rule these out. It's either white or it's black, well, then that would say that nothing's gray, green, blue, whatever, right? So false dichotomy, very different from excluded middle. Excluded middle, valid form of argument, or at least it is according to most logicians. False dichotomy is not. And I think false dichotomy often looks convincing because we mistake it for excluded middle, right? And I think sometimes people will push back on excluded middle when they shouldn't because they'll see it as a false dichotomy, which it isn't. Another example of excluded middle, all actions are either morally good or they're not, MX or not MX, right? And you might think, well, okay, so some actions are morally good, helping an old lady with her groceries, giving to charity, telling the truth when it's bad for you. Those are all morally good. Some things are morally bad, lying, killing, stealing. Well, but what about things that are neither? Getting my morning cup of coffee is not morally good or morally evil. But again, that's not an objection, right? All this says is, well, all actions are either morally good or they're not. That's perfectly consistent with some actions like getting coffee, watching a TV show, or whatever being morally neutral, neither good nor evil, right? That is a completely different thing than saying all actions are either morally good or evil. So hopefully you guys can see, the difference between excluded middle and a false dichotomy. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is a little complicated. It's just, I think, philosophically interesting. I'm not going to quiz you guys on it. It might be confusing for some of you, which is to say, if you're interested in some sort of philosophical issues with excluded middle, keep this rolling. If you're not, feel free to shut the lecture off now. All right. So let me just say a little bit philosophically about excluded middle. Most logicians treat this as a valid move, true by definition. Now, philosophically, there has been some pushback on excluded middle. It is a statement in logic that's actually a little bit controversial. Mainstream view is this is a valid way of arguing, and it's actually super important if you take higher level classes in, mathematics or logic. This is super important in a lot of proofs. Some people have pushed back on excluded middle for a few reasons. And I think it's interesting to talk about those, so I'll go through them really briefly. Why have people pushed back on excluded middle? Well, one, there are a lot of cases where things are vague, right? Give you guys an example. It hits a little close to home for me. Look, you could say, well, everyone's either bald or they're not, right? Well, maybe that's true, but what about what exact point do you become bald, right? Is there one morning where one final hair drops out of your head in the shower and you weren't bald before that and now you're bald, right? It's hard to say that. So, one of these reasons some people don't like excluded middle is these borderline cases, or these slow transitions, right? Obviously, if you're Lex Luthor, you're bald. If you are, I'm trying to think of somebody with a, you know, really impressive head of hair. All I can think of is Fabio, which is way outdated, and none of you know who he was. He was this guy famous for being on the covers of romance novels, right? Um, so that creates some problems. That's one reason some people push back on excluded middle. Another one, people will say with stuff in science, I don't pretend to understand this, but supposedly some results in quantum physics where things seem like they're not neatly one thing or the other. Some people will think that's maybe a reason to doubt excluded middle. Some mathematicians have doubted it. There was a big controversy between this guy Brewer and this guy Hilbert. Brewer doubted it. Hilbert liked it. Hilbert won the debate. I don't know. So if you ever take future philosophy classes, or even some math classes, people will say, well, there's maybe some doubt about this, there's some debate. Most people accept it, but those are the reasons for some debate about excluded middle. One of the reasons logicians and mathematicians like this is if you don't have it, especially when you get more advanced formal stuff, it just makes your life so much harder. This was actually Hilbert's main argument against Brewer. It's like, oh my God, do you know how hard it will be to do proofs if we don't have excluded middle? So anyway, who knows? We'll just keep this in mind. Most logicians accept it. The consensus view is it works. I'll actually send you guys an article. It's kind of advanced, but you actually get some maybe interesting results in science if you drop excluded middle. There's an article recently in The Atlantic I might talk about in the Zoom session, about how this could lead to some interesting results. Anyway, if none of that makes sense to you guys, don't worry. It will never be on a test. I just thought, philosophically that's interesting, so we should say a bit about it. All that will ever be on a test or anything like that is that excluded middle is different from a false dichotomy. Excluded middle works. Most logicians think it works. False dichotomy, no one thinks this works. Not a good form of argument. All right, hopefully that's clear to you guys. If the last bit isn't, like I said, don't worry.